Bitters are an essential part to any perfectly balanced cocktail. But what are they? In this video, I'm going to tell you all about them. Bitters, like I said, are an essential part to any cocktail. And if you watched the first video in this series on cocktail basics, you'll remember that the 5 key ingredients to the original cocktail was spirit, sweetener, spice, citrus, and a lengthener. And bitters they are that spice element. And if you haven't checked that video out, I do recommend you come on over here and going back, because this video is part of a series on cocktail basics. But before we get into what bitters are, I do want to make a distinction between cocktail bitters and sipping bitters. Cocktail bitters are going to be the ones that we're going to be focusing on this episode, and sipping bitters we are going to leave for another future video. Sipping bitters would be something along the lines of Amaro, or like a chartreuse or something like that, that technically they are a bitter, but they aren't exactly what we're focusing on in this video. And we will save that for another time. So what are bitters? I like to say that bitters are a bartender's spice rack. So a chef has their spice rack that they can call upon to finish out any dish, the same way that a bartender has all the different bitters bottles to be able to call upon to finish out a cocktail, to round it out, to flavor it, to season it in a way. The parallel that I like to bring up is if you've ever had beef without salt, you know that it doesn't really taste great. And as soon as you add salt, it's like the salt brings all of the flavor out of the meat. And that's essentially what a lot of bitters do. Bitters are often the answer to the question of, what is this cocktail missing? It's like, it feels like a cocktail's a little flat, like it's like 80% of the way there, but it just needs like a little bit of something to kind of brighten the flavors up and bring them all together. And bitters can do that. The same way that excellent spices do that for a lot of fantastic dishes in the culinary world. They can elevate, they can balance, and they can even sometimes carry a cocktail depending on how you use it. But there's a big misconception that people think that using bitters is gonna make your cocktail bitter. Well, the truth of the matter is that if used in small amounts, you probably won't even be able to tell what specific bitter was being used unless you train your palate 100%. But a lot of the work goes on in the background of a cocktail, just to kind of bind things together, hold things together, the same way that you just season your food. It shouldn't really be like it shouldn't come as a surprise. The same way that people season their food, you can season your cocktail. And it doesn't always have to be apparent. You add salt to a dish, that doesn't mean it's always salty, And so it's kind of a similar thing with bitters. So at their most basic, bitters are an aromatic flavoring agent made from infusing roots, seeds, bark, spices, fruit peels, herbs, flowers, or any botanicals in a high-proof spirit usually. So where do bitters come from? Well, the origin of bitters is, it actually started off for medicinal purposes. This was back in the day when doctors used to prescribe cocaine, so it wasn't really far-fetched for them to start prescribing alcohol to cure certain things. And it's actually still prevalent today, at least to an extent, in the service industry. We had this thing where if you have a stomach ache or you're not feeling too right, you do a couple splashes of Angostura bitters with either ginger beer or a ginger ale, and it's said to kind of cure it. Now, I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's been the case, but that has been prescribed and recommended to me by many, many people in the service industry. But let me know if you ever heard about that, because it's actually, at least in my experience, pretty common. And so it started off as a medicinal thing where doctors were prescribing it, and it was very, very popular. And so then all of a sudden, some people started adding it to cocktails in place of using other spices because it was a liquid spice. And so they really started to use it, and it kind of took a life of its own even after doctors stopped prescribing crazy things. And so what's even more fascinating is that for a really long time after Prohibition in America, it got to a point where there was only really 3 commercially available brands of bitters in the US, and most bars, if they had any bitters at all, it was probably like one dusty bottle of Angostura bitters, because it's specifically called for in a few of the cocktails that survived the disco/club culture era of drinking. Most people, if they think of bitters, they think of just the Angostura bitters with the oversized label, which I ripped off because I can't stand it, and a yellow cap. And this was one of the 3 widely available ones. And if I'm not mistaken, Peychaud's was one of the other 3 widely available ones. But what's fascinating about that is that prior to Prohibition, there were hundreds of different kinds of bitters available. This was back in the original cocktail heyday, and it's similar to kind of where we find ourselves today. There was so many widely available kinds of bitters, but then Prohibition came and really ruined a majority of the things happening in the American cocktail and spirit scene. And then the final nail in the coffin ended up being club culture and like just those like club drinks that there was no bitters going into any of that. And so thankfully, we've gotten to a point again where there are hundreds of different kinds of bitters available. And some people would even say that there's too many bitters available, but that is not a sentiment that we prescribe to on this channel or at our bar, because there can never be enough spices in the world and there can never be enough bitters in the world. So how do you actually use and assess these bitters in an actual cocktail if you're trying to come up with your own? Well, the way that I usually do it is I try to come up with the base of a cocktail first, make sure that I have almost like the groundwork all made up, like the different proportions of the juices to the sweetener to the spirit. And once you kind of have a good base, I think it's good to just try a couple of different ones. It's kind of trial and error. It's how it gets really kind of interesting and fun to learn and experience all these different bitters. So the way that I was always taught to kind of assess the flavor of a bitter is to open it up. You're gonna put a dash or two on the back of your hand or on your palm. You could do it on your wrist, lots of different ways. You just wanna have it be aerated. So we're gonna do it on the back of my hand. Oops, that's kind of a lot. We're gonna rub it in and then you can just smell it. And that's a good way for you to get an idea of what that is going to taste like. That was not very smooth, but we're gonna ignore that. But it's still a really good way to be able to taste I guess you could taste it, you know, but it's more about the smell so you can get the idea of what the flavors would be imparted by this specific bitter. And it's also important to know what kind of goes into each one to see what's going to match with the flavors, right? So you then have another classic in Reagan's Orange Bitters, which is really, really crucial because it imparts a good orangey flavor, which is a fantastic way to elevate some flavors in your cocktail. You also have Peychaud bitters, which are another one that's like super old and kind of funky and has a bunch of different mixes of herbs. Very common in Sazeracs or a lot of New Orleans cocktails use Peychauds. And then you got some really fun ones, like you have Aztec chocolate bitters. Some of my current favorites are what Bittermans has been doing. So their Hellfire Habanero Shrub is a bitters that I actually just recently used in a cocktail that's going on our menu at the restaurant in the spring, and I absolutely love it. It gives a nice little heat with a little bit of the vinegary-ness from the shrub. And then you also have Bitterman's Boston Bitters, which I actually just used in a pisco and gin cocktail, which really elevated the floral elements of both the pisco and the gin because they're both very botanical. And then you also have a really awesome one by Bitterman's as well, which is their Tiki Bitters. I'm not gonna even pretend to pronounce the Elamakulele bitters. So I use this in a tiki cocktail that's currently on our menu and I love it. It has guava, passion fruit, some cinnamon, some allspice. So there's some really awesome tropical flavors found in this by blending some earthier spices with some nice citrusy, fruity elements as well. And then the last bitter, I guess, that I find very fascinating as well is when you actually use like absinthe as a bitter. So for example, like in the Corpse Reviver #2, you do like 2 dashes of absinthe. So the interesting thing about bitters is that while we are talking about cocktail bitters, you can actually use a lot of different almost spicy spirits to be a bitter as well. But these are the most like kind of concentrated, industry standard almost that you may see in a lot of different bars. But the beauty of bitters is that you can actually make them yourself. And Brad Thomas Parsons, who has written a lot of fantastic cocktail books, he has this entire book on bitters, and there are recipes for making your own cocktails that call for bitters. It dives into the history of bitters way more than I can do in a short video like this. So if you're interested in this, I'm gonna put a link in the description below just for you to take a look at this. It is a fantastic book, and if it interests you that much, you should definitely check it out. It has a lot of really good insights in there. But that's enough from me. I'm gonna get to making myself a cocktail, and we'll catch you guys in the next one. Cheers.